Hello and welcome to Critical Line Item. My name's Tom Rablick. Thanks for joining me for this podcast. We're living in pretty turbulent political times at the moment, and we're seeing a range of things that are um, quite quite disturbing emerge from all over the place, whether it be events in China, whether it be events domestically, and also uh, the nature of political discourse. I'm joined today by someone who knows a lot about this. He's been around for a very long time. He's a respected journalist and author, Channel 9's political editor, Chris Uhlmann, who'll take us through some of this material today, as well as sort of probably provide you some food for thought. Chris, thanks for joining me.
G'day, Tom.
Now, viewers, readers, and listeners strike us at different points in time in our careers. There'll be those who only know you for what you've done on Channel 9 and for what you've said on Twitter. Would you mind giving people a précis of your career? What would it look like on the back of an envelope?
Oh, late bloomer, some talent, an enormous amount of luck. Starts at the Canberra Times at the age of 29, goes on into the ABC, into broadcasting, Parliament House, and then on to Channel 9 as political editor also at the ABC. So I feel like I've been extremely fortunate in the time that I've been in journalism, which is now the last 30 years.
Why did journalism appeal to you? Was there any other profession you wanted to get into?
Well, when I left school, mate, I joined a Catholic seminary and was there for 3.5 years before realising that wasn't the job opportunity that I was after, and then emerged into a recession. And I did a number of things. I was a storeman and packer. I was a security guard in the western suburbs of Sydney, and they didn't seem like great career options either. And so finally, at the beginning of 1989, I packed all my worldly possessions into a 1969 Valiant and headed to Canberra, which is where my parents were, and got a job as a copy kid at the Canberra Times at the age of 29, and thought, as I watched people around me work, I could do this. And that's how I got into journalism.
It's an interesting story, Chris, but also the life experience must also contribute to the way you look at issues. Do you find that when you write and when you report?
It actually really does, because, you know, that period of time I spent particularly living in the western suburbs of Sydney, and particularly during times of recession, I think of what it was like sitting on that dock as a storeman and packer back in the 1980s. I think of what it was like patrolling Mount Druitt Market Town, and I think of the people that I knew then and the lives that they led and what was really important to them. And then I think about some of the stuff that we report from day to day in federal politics, and I do know that none of them will be worried about the things that we worry about. What worries ordinary people, or, you know, people that aren't inside the Canberra bubble, is, you know, how are they going to feed their families? How are they going to pay for their existence? What are the things that will secure their lives and their livelihood? How can they lead happy and healthy lives? Sometimes the stuff we discuss here is so removed from that as to be on another planet.
Is this part of the problem with the disaffection with politics, that it tends to be people tend to be obsessed in the political environment, and they forget who put them in?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the things that you know, I'm constantly reminded of is that many of the issues that we debate, not all, but many of them, are really removed from people's lives and their livelihoods. And I do think that we tend on occasions to get stuck inside a certain, you know, a certain story or a certain issue, that while it might be of prurient interest to some people in, you know, the political sphere and perhaps some people beyond, it almost doesn't resonate at all with the rest of the country while they get on with going about their business. And by the way, you know, I get some people, it's quite remarkable the number of people that say to me, oh, you know, some people shouldn't be allowed to vote because they simply don't know enough about what's going on. I mean, the level of arrogance in that is just staggering. I mean, people everywhere are essentially interested in how they can lead good and happy lives. You know, just because they're not interested in the things that obsess the political classes doesn't rule them out of the rights to have opinions.
The interesting thing about watching you and others on television, is that I'm well aware that the minutes you spend on TV are nowhere near a fair representation of the work you do outside of that short broadcast space you occupy. When you start your day, what's the first thing you look for? What's the brain food that you consume to catch up with what goes on?
So, every day in some way starts the night before, as you're leaving work with, where, for example, the leaders are going to be the following day. Well, one of the things about television, though, it is a large logistical exercise. So we actually need to know the sort of physical position of the leader of the opposition and the prime minister every single day. So some of it's that kind of stuff. Is like, where are they? What are they going to be doing? And of course, what they're doing and where they are tells you a lot about where they think the issues lie, or at least the kinds of issues they'd like to get across. So there's conversations really the night before. I was doing the Today Show this morning, which means that essentially, if I want to, get some exercise and get in here by the time that I'm supposed to be on air, I usually get up around about 5 o'clock. I like to sort of see what's running in the papers, so scan the headlines at least of all of the papers. I tend now just to really look for the issues that I know that I'll be dealing with. So I skip past the crime news and the business news and things, and look straight at what's been running on the political sphere. And then really the guts of this job, if you're doing it properly, and sometimes it's hard to keep up, is to constantly be in conversations with people. So it is to be calling those people, on both sides, on all sides of the political sphere, who are, busy going about their jobs. So it's lots of telephone conversations with people that say, okay, what are you up to? How do you think things are running? The government wants to talk about vaccines, but of course, the best example we've had of government being knocked off its kilter is all of the sex scandals and the rape scandals that have been ricocheting around Parliament House for 3 weeks now. It means that the government essentially hasn't been able to talk about the things that it thinks will resonate with the community, and that's jabs and jobs. So, that's essentially, the daily task is to try and keep track of what's going on, what might be breaking. And if you have time, and it's getting harder and harder with all the different platforms, it is to be poking around, trying to find out the things that people don't want you to know.
The other thing that I've noticed, and then you've caused considerable, and I won't say angst, but you've caused a bit of excitement recently on Twitter. How much has the sort of Twitter, Facebook, and type environment enhanced or detracted from news gathering?
I think that there was a revolution that happened in 2007 with the arrival of the iPhone. I think, history will show that was one of the great markers in the change in the way that media works. If you think about the cost of production, so before the iPhone arrives, really the big barrier to anyone who wanted to be a publisher or a broadcaster, the cost of production. I remember the Canberra Times went searching for a colour press back in the 1990s. And the costs of that press ran to the tens of millions of dollars to get the very newest colour printing press. No one but a company could organise to do that. And the costs of doing television, you needed to have cameras, you needed to have people who could move them around, camera operators, you need to have satellites if you wanted to do international broadcasts. The iPhone arrives and all of a sudden the cost of broadcasting and publishing dropped to zero. So everyone is a broadcaster now. Everybody is involved in it. Now, there have been some great boons to that. There have also been some enormous problems that go with all of that. And really, one of the biggest problems I think is Twitter is the best example of it. Twitter is the sewer of the internet. There you'll find some good information and an enormous amount of dross, but more than anything else, you'll find personal abuse in spades as people who believe that they should dominate the cultural conversation, try to beat anyone else who doesn't agree with them out of that conversation. I really rarely actually engage on Twitter. I throw things up on it, and every now and then I do what I call poking the bear, which is just to throw something out which I know will obsess them for the entire day, and then shutting my system down and not reading another word of it.
Is this where top of the morning sewer rats comes in?
Absolutely. Like, the thing is, I have seen some of my best friends, and by the way, quite a lot of them are women, bashed in the public square. I'm thinking about people like Lee Sales, for example. My friend Jane Norman, who was at the on the receiving end of the most scurrilous campaign to try and raise allegations about her, which are completely the invention of some fetid mind. I watch this stuff happen all the time by people who brand themselves progressives. This is the progressive class. This is the left, by the way, that's conducting this cultural bullying that I see going on. So I have no qualms in describing them that way, because that's the way that they behave. And if, my father was in the army. I moved every 2 years. I was a little fat kid who had to move playgrounds in primary school. And at each of those primary schools, I got beaten up by whoever the local bully was, and, cowered in fear in each playground until I finally turned up in one in Canberra, stood up for myself, got beaten up again, but thought, at least I have some level of self-respect now. At least I'm not running away in the playground. And so I've always loathed bullies, and that's what these people are. And I find them appalling.
I've observed some of that. And it's something that I wanted to touch on with you, because you're probably amongst the people who does commentary and analysis in an interesting way. But then there's the notion of pure reportage that a couple of people have raised with me from time to time in discussion. And how much of what we do in journalism today is analysis, is the Congress, is the placing of things of context and a view upon what has gone on, as opposed to straight reportage, Chris?
Yeah. Well, look, everyone has a worldview, right? You cannot disconnect yourself from it. You are formed by your experiences through life. Nobody comes to anything in a completely objective way. There is some subjectivity. I always think of that ancient saying, give me a lever and a place on which to stand and I will move the earth. Well, the reason you couldn't move the earth is because you had no place to stand. But on earth, all of us have somewhere to actually stand, and all of us do have a worldview. And in any that, you think about the news stories I do in the evening, and if it's not a particularly big news day, the default position for commercial television news story is 90 seconds. I mean, I laugh out loud when people keep saying to me, oh, you can't fit that in a 30-second grab. I think, when have you ever seen a 30-second grab on commercial television? You got 4 seconds for me to super you, and then I'm looking for a reason to get rid of you. So all of what we do is about making choices, and all of what you see is not the entire picture. I mean, that is the nature of discourse. So, there is a level of subjectivity in every single piece of news. However, I mean, that we would go back to what my first editor, Crispin Hull, said to me on the day that I walked into his office. He said, the two things I'm interested in are fairness and balance. You try and strike those marks. You give people the chance to defend themselves, and you try and make sure that they have an equal opportunity to defend themselves. And that's a good starting point. Journalism is flawed, but I think that I haven't heard a better starting point for it than that. Now, an enormous amount of the other stuff that we hear, including the stuff that I do, falls into the commentary sphere. We are awash with that now. That is everywhere in the political space. So once upon a time, you would have it clearly marked that something was a piece of news and something else was a piece of commentary.
Yeah.
And I think that line is now really quite muddied.
That brings me to the next issue. You mentioned that your first editor talked about fairness and balance and giving people a reasonable crack. It would be, I would not be doing listeners to this justice if we didn't talk about the past week or so that we've seen the story emerge in relation to historic allegations that involve Christian Porter. How, setting aside the allegations themselves, have you seen the evolution of that story and also the population of and the function of social media in it?
Oh, there's not a shadow of a doubt. There's been a witch hunt with Christian Porter at the centre of it. That there is, the political hands in this story are all over the place. And, I leave it to people to go back and look at those who have populated the stories in which this first emerged and ask them what their political allegiance are, or what axes they might have to grind. So watching a story, think to yourself when you're seeing someone, what is their connection in this story to a political party or a political grievance? And people can go and find their own examples of that. But in the Christian Porter story, it is rich with them. So there's a lot more going on here than an allegation of rape 33 years ago. This one in particular is being weaponized by the opponents of Christian Porter, some people who have hated him since they were teenagers, and some people who've grown to hate him through the course of his political life, and some people who are clearly and obviously his avowed political opponents. As I say, go and look at the first Four Corners program on Christian Porter and look at who is commentating and see how they measure up against some of those markers.
And the role of social media obviously has been, it plays out as well. I mean, I should preface this question by saying everyone's entitled to commentary in the public square, but it's been interesting to observe the crescendo from the Friday when the story appeared on the ABC website, over through to Wednesday when Christian Porter appeared, and the subsequent continual discussion.
Well, I say this to you. I mean, like, this is not a defense of Christian Porter, this next bit. This is in the absence of proof. So this is essentially an unknowable crime. It committed between two people, alleged to have happened 33 years ago, and one of those people is dead, and the other denies it absolutely. So there is no evidence that will ever stand up in court that can convict Christian Porter. So in the absence of that evidence, people are saying there should be, and this is their term, an independent inquiry. Well, by its very nature, the inquiry into Christian Porter would have to have a lower burden of proof than the one that you'd have in a criminal court. So what is that burden of proof? Who gets to decide what kind of inquiry? Could it be a parliamentary inquiry? Well, no, everyone in Parliament is obviously partisan. If it's some sort of quasi-judicial inquiry, could the Prime Minister get to appoint the person? Would that person be allowed, in the eyes of those commentators, to be a man, or could it only be a woman? If the Prime Minister appoints, then surely the charge will be, oh, the Prime Minister's appointed his own man or his own woman. It will be a whitewash. What if some other body then gets to decide who the person is appointed? Well, who gets to do that? Because the Prime Minister is obviously not going to let go of it, and anything that Parliament might throw up would, of course, again be accused of some sort of partisanship. What are the rules of evidence? Will they be heard in public? Will he be able, or she be able, to call witnesses? So when you look at all of this, I can guarantee you that if Scott Morrison crucified Christian Porter out the front of Parliament House, the call from some would be, he did it too late. You know, in the eyes of those who are chasing Christian Porter now, he will always be guilty. And that's why you've got to ask the question about, you know, can he maintain his position in public life? Apart from the mental stresses of the thing, he will face this constant drumbeat of the fact that he hasn't cleared his name. And the tragedy for him is he'll never be able to clear his name.
Chris, there's also something else playing out here from where I sit, and I'll make this the final question. I know you've got a lot to do and you've been generous with your time. We've seen some curious polling results in relation to Anthony Albanese and members of the Labor Party. And polling tends to portray the Prime Minister, or give us a number that says the Prime Minister is more popular at the moment than the opposition leader. How does something like the current discourse about, you know, historical rape allegations and similar impact on the PM and the government in that context?
It certainly can't help. I think that it tarnishes all of Parliament, and you know, yet again, all politicians with the same brush. That, you know, that it's all pretty grubby what goes on up here. In fact, I genuinely have always thought that politicians are a pretty fair reflection of the population. Quite frankly, I mean, But nobody else has a camera following them around 24/7, asking them questions or peering into their private lives. If they did, then a lot more people would bite the dust. But look, it can't help the Prime Minister. The good news, Tom, is that people have stopped asking me whether or not there's going to be an early election. I kept saying to them, "Well, you don't know what it's going to look like in the middle of the year, do you? It might look good for Scott Morrison now." People forget that this is a very tight parliament. Just became even tighter with another member of the coalition deciding that they're going to go and sit on the crossbench. So I thought for ages that that put this polling aside, which by the way was stonkingly wrong at the last election, and Anthony Albanese is absolutely in the hunt at the next election. It is very close. You can't see the future. You don't know what the circumstances will be. I think the two biggest threats to the Prime Minister are not necessarily this scandal, but the dismount for JobKeeper and JobSeeker, which we're seeing at the end of this month. We will see a rise in unemployment. Just in terms of how bad that is, that'll have an effect on the Morrison government. And the vaccine rollout. If something goes significantly wrong, or the population is disappointed by the fact that, for example, there's a variant and this doesn't help us in the way that we hoped, then I think the level of disappointment with the Morrison government will be high, and it will face a really tough battle to win the next election.
You are also an author. You've written 3 books. Have you got another one on the go?
I keep promising that I'll never write another book. My co-author Steve Lewis is in the midst of writing one at the moment. I've offered some advice, but not much more than moral support on that. But I'm actually writing a children's book with my younger brother Paul, who's an artist, and that'll be published next year by Walker Books. It's called The Useless Tune. And children's books, thankfully, are way shorter than adults' books.
I've been through the process of writing 2 books over the past couple of years. I fully appreciate the challenge.
Never again.
Listen. I'd love to do. I'd love to sink my teeth into something on terrorism and extremism. Given I've gone through it, but it is a tough call. Where can people get your stuff if they want to look it up?
In terms of the books and stuff, it's all printed by HarperCollins. So if you're looking for Marmalin Files, Mandarin Code, and Shadow Game are the names of the books. But if you were looking for a cheaper way rather than buying all 3 of those, it was all re-edited into a book called, because it was based on the television series that came after it. So Secret City, The Capitol Files is the compilation of all 3 of those books if you were looking for them.
Chris, it's been a wonderful opportunity to talk to you, and a privilege as well. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, mate.
No worries. Thank you.